Good morning, everyone. We're so happy for you to hear. We're so happy to have you here for our occasional, roughly monthly resilience presentation series hosted by the ETSU Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute. If you would like to be added to our email list, please type your email address in the chat and we'll be delighted to add you, and that way we can inform you of future presentations as part of our speaker series. My name is Wallace Dixon and I am the director of the Strong Brain Institute. The Strong Brain Institute was founded by a $1 million 5-year gift to ETSU from Ballad Health, and I'm truly honored to be asked to help lead and build the organization. The majority of Americans have experienced at least one major adverse experience at some point in their childhood. At ETSU specifically, 1 in 4 of our students have lived through or may still be living through 3 or more major adverse experiences. The goal of the Strong Brain Institute is to use the science of childhood adversity, coupled with mitigation science and resilience science, to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of ACEs on children's and adults' lives, and to promote awareness and the use of resilience-informed procedures and policies, both at ETSU and throughout the Appalachian Highlands region. We are a resource for people to turn to when they have questions about how best to employ resilience-informed strategies and practices in their workspace. At this point, I'll hand it over to Michelle Moser, one of the founding members of the Strong Brain Institute, to introduce our guests.
Good morning, everyone. I'm particularly really excited, excuse me, that you're all here. I'm Michelle Moser. I'm a member, as Wally said, of the Strong Brain Institute and also the ETSU Director of a Center of Excellence for Children in State Custody. I'm really excited to have our presenters who are part of an organization taking resiliency into action with implementing a trauma-informed approach in an agency that includes leaders and administrators and therapists and foster parents and all kinds of staff at all kinds of levels. I'm looking forward to hearing about this organizational transformation. I had the privilege of working on a pilot program several years ago where we used the attachment regulation and competency model to train up a couple treatment teams in 2 foster care agencies. So I got the opportunity to have a really close observation of both the immense challenges and the really cool positive transformations that occurred when everybody was kind of rowing in the same direction. Before I introduce our presenters, I just want to say a reminder, you can say hello in the chat, and our speakers are going to engage with you in the chat, but also through that Q&A. Because it's a webinar, unfortunately, we can't see you. So you can put your questions in the chat, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring that. The PowerPoint will be shared. That's always a question, so we're going to head that off. We have a PDF of the PowerPoint, and that'll be put in the chat. At the end, we would really appreciate if you all would give us a little bit of feedback. It's very brief, 3-question feedback, but it really helps us with developing this resiliency series. And the other question is, we don't have CEs, but we will have a certificate of attendance, and that will be distributed after the talk. So now it is my real pleasure to introduce 2 very gifted clinical leaders in the child mental health field, Chris Moyniham and Nic Shields. I have the honor of getting to work with them on projects, so it's particularly exciting for me to have them here. Chris Moyniham is a licensed clinical social worker and is currently the Chief Clinical Officer for Omni Family of Services, a multi-state human service agency serving children and adults. In his current role, Chris provides organizational leadership and clinical oversight of the therapeutic services offered to children and families. Chris emphasizes an attachment-based approach to treatment that identifies and mitigates the impact of complex trauma and neglect. Chris has prior treatment experience working in private practice, special education, residential, and crisis setting. Originally from New England, Chris and his wife have 3 school-age children and live in the greater Nashville area. And now turning to our second presenter, Nic. Nic Shields is a licensed professional counselor. He completed his bachelor's in psychology and master's in counseling from ETSU. Go Bucks. Nic has been employed by Omni Visions for 9 years, where he has worked as a therapist. the director for a residential facility, a program director, and currently serves as the clinical director for foster care. Nic has a passion for working with individuals with trauma. Nic provides consultation and training for providers, parents, and foster parents around trauma-informed approaches. So I would like you to join me in welcoming Chris and Nic, who are presenting Implementing a Trauma-Informed Approach, the Attachment, Regulation, and Competency Framework. So take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michelle. Just briefly before we jump in, I just wanted to thank the Institute for having us today. The work that the Institute is doing to mitigate the impact of ACEs and trauma on children and families, young adults, is really the most important work I think we can be doing in our society, in our communities. So on behalf of everyone, thank you to the Institute for all you're doing and for hosting us today. So we're going to kind of jump in here. Michelle kind of gave us a very gracious introduction. Just to kind of reiterate that, my name is Chris Moyniham. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer for the Omni family of services, and we'll kind of dig into what that is here in a little bit. I have worked in a lot of different settings, and from crisis to residential to foster care to special ed, and trauma-informed services and practices is something that's very, very important to me. It's something I'm very passionate about, something that's very dear to my heart for the work that I've done. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. Nic, do you just want to say hi real quick before we jump in?
Yeah. Thanks everyone. Thanks for having us. I'm Nic Shields. I'm the clinical director, as you all heard, for OmniVision's foster care. And it's just a pleasure to get to be here today and speak to you all. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Nic. So we're going to share some slides, and we're going to talk with you all today a little bit about our experience implementing a trauma-informed approach. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the approach that we ran with. So our learning objectives today, what we really want to communicate is a general brief understanding of the ARC model, the Attachment, Regulation, and Competency Framework. That's the model that we chose to implement as part of our trauma-informed care approach. We want to help understand the role of concrete deliverables in trauma-informed care implementation. And we'd like to identify, talk a little bit about some of the barriers we run into. I think that's an important part of this discussion. We want to have a frank discussion about what this looks like, what our experience was, kind of all of the above, because there's a lot to it. And so hopefully we can get into some of that. Real quick, before we do all that though, we did want to just do a quick check with you guys and see, using the chat, if you could just take just 1 second to use the chat. Some folks already started, but we just wanted to kind of get a handle of who we have in the audience, what kind of roles. If you haven't put your role or what it is you do in the chat, if you could throw that in there, that'd be helpful. We're just trying to know who the audience is. And then we wanted to ask a second question. So real simple question. And we like to start a lot of our discussions and meetings and a lot of things with what we call ritual questions. And we'll talk about that later on. If you work at Omni, you know that there's a question coming before every meeting, and that's a thing that we do on purpose. So we wanted to ask, on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being very, very informed and 1 being not very informed at all, how trauma-informed do you feel? So how trauma-informed do you feel on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being very informed, 1 being not so much? Seeing lots of 3s and 4s rolling in, which is great. And there's a variety of roles and such come in. So that's great. All right. A variety of roles come in. There's lots of different folks from different fields here. So that's fantastic. So hopefully what we talk about today will be useful in some ways, relevant to everybody on some level. It's interesting, the question about trauma-informed care, to me, because I always wanted to be trauma informed, and I always kind of wondered, when was I officially trauma informed and when was I not? You know, so that's something that I'll probably speak to that a couple times as we talk. But if you, just one other thing, if you have thoughts or questions as this comes up, please feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A box. We'll be watching that, but we'd love to make this interactive as we can. So diving in, before we start talking about this trauma-informed care and all this word trauma, I want to throw out a caution. And I want to throw out a caution about the word trauma, because there's some things that come up with the word trauma that I've observed in the last couple of years that I think are relevant to this discussion. A couple of different things that pop up around the word trauma that I think are worth just being mindful around. The word trauma, there are a lot of variations in understanding about this word. It's used very liberally, I think, in our fields now, in the helping fields. But what I've observed is that there are some folks who understand the implications, who understand the brain science that's involved, that understand how the nervous system reacts, triggers, all those sorts of things, and have a good handle of treatment options for it. And then there's folks on the other end of the spectrum who have a different sort of understanding, that they know it's something that's bad, that people have been through, but don't have quite the same grasp on it that others do. And so it's important to understand that we're all coming to this from a different place of learning. And so the word trauma, means different things to different folks. Another concern or just thing to be mindful of, and I see this a lot, and this is something that's I'm pretty passionate about. We always have to be cautious that trauma does not become institutionalized language. The term trauma, if you work in child welfare or you work in mental health, the term trauma gets used pretty liberally. And I think it's important that we never truly forget. And sometimes we need to stop and be mindful of what that really means. It could be a small child who is abused, and remembering that they were truly physically abused and what that consists of, or a 17-year-old who was trafficked, or a 20-year-old who, a staff member who was involved in a school shooting. These are the worst things that occur in people's lives. And it's always important that we never minimize that, unintentionally, of course. Nobody would ever mean to, but the language, we don't want it to become just jargon or institutionalized language. I think another thing that's important to keep in mind with the word trauma is we kind of use trauma as a catch-all for a lot of bad things, but trauma has not all traumas are manifest the same way. It's a little bit overly general at times. If you are a 18-year-old who was in a car crash, that is a different sort of impact than if you are a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old who's been experiencing ongoing domestic violence in their house, right? Those both, not to compare one to the other, but they're different in how they are going to manifest. And that's important to remember, because treatment options become, that's important for treatment. So the last thing around that, the word trauma creates a lot of resistance in folks. And it's something that's fascinating to me. It's something that I think is worth exploring. I don't always know, I don't claim to know all the reasons why, but the word trauma can bring up a lot of resistance in clients, and more so often in staff and programmatic challenges. And so as we talk today, we'll probably flip back and forth between clients and staff, because when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're really talking about both. And so that's something we kind of flip back and forth between. So just being mindful with this word, that there are variations in understanding of what trauma means, that it can be we don't run a risk of it becoming institutionalized language, the impact of trauma is a broad spectrum, and that sometimes can bring up resistance. We think those are important things to be mindful of as we have this conversation. So what is trauma-informed care? We're going to talk a little bit about how we've approached this. I was looking for some general definitions. This was one that kind of jumped out at me. Trauma-informed care understands and considers the pervasive nature of trauma and promotes environments of healing, and rather than recovery rather than practices and services that may inadvertently re-traumatize. That's one of the better definitions I've found for this, and I would suggest that is still a mouthful. There's a lot to that, and that is one of the subtle challenges, I think, to implementing trauma-informed care. The definitions can sometimes be a bit ambiguous, a bit broad. And I think that we have to kind of pick this apart and break it down a little bit for us to truly understand what some of these definitions are getting at. And so I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to look at what SAMHSA offers. And so SAMHSA offers these 4 R's of trauma-informed care, and we've tacked another one on here that we can talk about here in a second. But how do you know if you're trauma-informed, right? What does that mean to be doing that? So first R is realizes the widespread impact of trauma. Trauma is present in looking at all the different roles that are that popped up in the chat. Trauma is present in almost everything we do. If you work in child welfare, if you work in policy around health and things along those lines, if you work in outpatient behavioral health, we know that the average ACE score for a child in foster care is 5. We know the average ACE score for the child in juvenile justice is 6. We know that people who are dealing with homelessness, there's a trauma history in about 90% of those folks. 90% of the people who access community-based mental health services have a trauma history. Substance abuse, you're 15 to 20 times more likely to have a trauma background. So we have to realize that this is really at the heart of 90% of what we do on a daily basis, regardless of who your population is that you work with. Acknowledging that, accepting that, and starting from that starting line, I think is really, really important. The next R is recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients, families, and staff, and others involved with the system. I really think about this in regards to clients, and I have these conversations with therapists, fairly frequently. I feel that trauma-informed care is done a disservice by the DSM, and I'll throw out there's my little soapbox for you real quick. We have all of these diagnoses that are out there, but so frequently they are the manifestations of trauma, and we just don't adequately have the right, the right labels for them. We have PTSD. But again, trauma is bigger than that in a lot of ways and has manifests itself in a lot of the symptoms that get diagnosed as something else, right? So do we understand that that child with intermittent explosive disorder or disruptive mood is probably, coming from those could be signs and symptoms of a trauma background? Do we explore that depression diagnosis, where that comes from? Because that oftentimes is the manifestation of a trauma background. Do we explore that anxiety issue, from that perspective? Because oftentimes those sorts of symptoms are the expression of trauma that's gone unrecognized or unacknowledged. Do we see that aggressive parent, that parent who is difficult to deal with? Are we recognizing that might be a sign of their own trauma that has maybe gone unaddressed? So are we realizing that it's impacting us in a widespread way? Are we recognizing the signs and symptoms? And then are we responding? How are we responding once we know that that's the case? Are we putting this in our policies? Are we putting this in our procedures? What's our daily practices look like? How are our settings kind of geared? We could talk about that for an extremely long time, right? There are trauma-informed methodologies that have been well established. And those are the things we want to be embedding into our practice once we realize and recognize that the trauma is ever present. The fourth R is resist re-traumatization. And if we aren't doing those first 3, we really run the risk of that fourth one. We run the risk of re-traumatization. Our clients are the people who come to us are highly vulnerable as a result of what they've been through. And unfortunately, at times our practices, while with the best of intentions, inadvertently cause re-traumatization. And finally, and this is why one of the reasons I love even the introduction to what was said about the Institute, we really want to add this 5th R, and we really want to be resiliency focused. A lot of what is commonplace in trauma processing and practice is about, talking about all the bad things that have happened. And there's a place and time where we have to do processing, and then not to be dismissive of that. But we also know that by cultivating protective factors, we really give folks the best chance that they can to overcome, and there is an ever growing body of research out there on resiliency. In our trauma treatment, are we focusing on things like cultivating relationships with caring adults? Are we focusing on things like connecting individuals to community resources where they can feel a sense of connection? Are we focusing on helping our clients feel feelings of self-efficacy, and as a result, hope? We are doing some interesting things with some partners of ours around the science around hope, and how do we cultivate hope? How do you develop hope? Because we know, and Harvard's got a lot of research on this, that hope is a protective factor. But what we would argue is that when we're talking about operating from a trauma-informed practice, we just can't hope that they have hope. We have to take active steps to help cultivate that and develop that. So those are the R's around trauma-informed care from SAMHSA. And you know, I've seen these for a long time, but I remember back several years back, I was kind of earlier in my career. I knew that trauma was the heart of everything that was going on with my clients. I knew I wanted to be trauma informed, but I didn't necessarily know what that meant. I was like, okay, so I know some stuff about trauma. I want my agency to be trauma informed. You know, I wanted a stamp of approval that said I was trauma informed. I wanted to know I was doing all I could. I wanted some sort of baseline. And I found that really frustrating that I couldn't find that. So I want to kind of boil these 4 R's down and give you what I would call a baseline. You know, this is in its simplest form. If you're doing these 3 things, I think you're on your way to being trauma informed. So I want to be really concrete, and we'll talk about being concrete a lot as we talk this through, because trauma informed can be somewhat ambiguous at times. But is your agency assessing for trauma? If you're working with clients, is your agency using some sort of structured approach to assess or screen for trauma? Maybe a CATS assessment, or UCLA assessment. Are you doing an ACE screener? Are you doing a psychosocial, and are trauma questions embedded in that? Is there a methodology or a practice where you are assessing your clients for trauma? That's got to be, you know, step 1. Step 2, are you teaching your staff and clients about trauma with regularity? Now, I think the regularity is an important part to that. You know, a lot of times you'll see a one-off training on trauma here and there, but we all know that turnover happens. We'll talk about turnover a little bit later. We all know that, you know, that we have run out of time, right? Time is a challenge at times. So are we teaching and educating our staff on a regular basis about what trauma is and its impact? And then the third thing I would say is a necessity is your agency treating or referring for trauma-specific treatment? Now, if you are a treating type of facility or agency, are you using specific trauma treatments? We know that there's a bunch out there. There's TFCBT and EMDR and TBRI and all those. You know, and if you don't provide treatment, are you referring to agencies or other providers that you know do provide trauma-specific treatment? If you're doing those 3 things and you really just want something super concrete, you know, I think that that's the baseline for being trauma informed. But obviously we can grow upon that and develop that. Now, there are a few barriers that we just want to touch on with trauma informed care. Again, sometimes it's not operationalized in a manner that's really helpful if you're trying to roll it out on a large scale. I think it's easier for an individual to be trauma informed than it is for an agency to be trauma informed. There are limited resources oftentimes in our challenges to implement things like this. If you have to, you know, if you're fighting to keep the lights on, or you have to procure a grant, or you have to secure funding, a lot of times that's a basic need that has to happen first, and then you know that can be a competing priority, right? There are a number of competing priorities that are out there when it comes to these sorts of implementations. And then the last, you know, there's one other barrier I just want to throw out, because I've seen this occur several times, and I think it's an important thing to acknowledge and be transparent about. Trauma-informed care implementation sometimes creates division within an agency. And it's interesting because I've seen this happen multiple times in different settings. And I think one of the things that you see come up is there is a debate or conflict around psychological safety and accountability. And sometimes people push back on trauma-informed care because they say, oh, we're just letting everybody off the hook, or we're not holding anybody accountable, or we're placating. I've heard all of those arguments. It creates a hard time for HR. And I've seen multiple HR issues that come up if you're in agencies around how do we hold people accountable to their job expectations while creating space and room for the, for their own mental health and their psychological safety and things along those lines. It's something that I think is worth acknowledging because it does come up. And I think that the balance between, if you look at any of the work from an Amy Edmondson or the Google Aristotle project, there's some big agencies that have really looked at psychological safety, which is a parallel to trauma-informed care. There also has to be accountability, or as a colleague, as a colleague of ours says, expectation for change, right? And so I think that's something to acknowledge. It's just part of it, and I think that's it can be a big barrier if we don't think about that on the front end. So being trauma-informed, the one thing I would throw out, being trauma-informed is a practice. I always wanted that stamp of approval that said I was officially trauma-informed. I don't think there is one. I don't think there is a finish line. I think we are at the early stages of really still understanding trauma and how to work with it and go from there. And so being trauma-informed is an ongoing practice. And I think the best way to really approach that practice is by looking at the principles of a trauma-informed approach. And I'm now seeing that slide is a little typo there. But go ahead, Nick.
Chris, we had a question come through. So before we get too far past that, someone talked about that they work at an agency where they are not a medical or mental health agency, but they assume that any person coming in may have experienced trauma, ensure that the program served trauma survivors. So they do not assess, however, because it's not our business. How does that relate to the first concrete suggestion of assessing clients for trauma? Are we doing something wrong?
That's a good question. I think what I hear in that statement is there's already an informal assessment being made that there's an assumption that all clients have trauma. And I think, honestly, that is kind of an informal assessment. Different practices, different agencies, I think that we have to be able to make accommodations for that. I think depending on the service, I think that the industry and the service probably plays into that to an extent. But I do think that you're making an informal assessment by saying we make the assumption that everybody has trauma coming in. I don't think you can go wrong by treating people from a trauma-informed approach. I think that you can go wrong if you don't acknowledge it. So I'm not sure if that necessarily answers the question. I think I'd be more interested to know what the agency was what service they were providing. I think there are a lot of different levels of trauma screening that you can do. So, sometimes we don't have to do a full-on deep dive trauma assessment. Sometimes a simple screener or an ACE screener is plenty, and we, there's a lot of ways we could talk about how to deliver those sorts of screeners and things along those lines, which I think is really a next step. But I do think that I hear in that statement that there's an informal assessment being made, that there's an assumption that trauma is present for everybody. And I think that that's probably adequate. So that's a great question. I love that question. Because again, we have to kind of figure out how, this is what's been relevant for us. But I think, like I said, we're at the beginning stages still of understanding. This is really, trauma-informed practice is only 30, 40 years old, really. It really evolved out of a lot of the Vietnam vets coming home, right? And so for years, it was really geared around adults. And then, we started to merge some of that stuff that we did with adults to kids. So what I would suggest to anybody is we're still at the beginning stages of this, and we need to continue to think about it critically and go from there. And that's why I think these principles are important. So, these are the principles of trauma-informed care and again, I think these kind of came from SAMHSA. But are we creating safety, trustworthiness, peer support? Are we operating from a place of collaboration and empowerment? And are we mindful of cultural, historical, and gender issues? These are really great principles, regardless if you're coming from a trauma-informed approach or not. I think, what we've seen coming out of COVID is there's a lot of people talking about these types of principles, regardless if it's a trauma-informed approach or not. I'm sure there's Brene Brown fans out there, or Simon Sinek fans out there, or Adam Grant fans out there. Those organizational psychologists who are looking at organizations and good leadership. These are just really good skills for leaders, as going forward. But if we are practicing and doing our best to operate from these principles, I think we're moving in a trauma-informed approach. So yeah, so that was quite a bit about trauma-informed approach in general, but wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are, and then Nick's going to kind of talk about the model we chose and how we approached our implementation. So our why, we're the Omni Family of Services. Our why, the reason we get up every day, is to try to advance hope and healing. We really want to instill hope in individuals of all ages and help them overcome the challenges that has been put in front of them. The way we try to do that, how we try to do that, is by providing best possible practice. And what we do is a little bit of everything. We do foster care, treatment foster care. We do in-home support. We do outpatient. We do med management. We do intensive in-home. We're in multiple states, Indiana, Kentucky, North Carolina, and the largest foster care provider in Tennessee. So we have a large organization, and as we talked about how to get into this trauma-informed, pushing this down, that's part of the discussion, because for smaller agencies, you may have different challenges, and bigger agencies may have a different set of challenges. So a few years ago, kind of starting to talk a little bit about our experience. A few years ago, early 2020, before everything went haywire, leadership really wanted to implement a cohesive and consistent thread across all of the services that we provided. We wanted to be speaking a similar language. We wanted to be talking, with the same vernacular and same words, and cutting back on some of those things. We wanted to be looking at things from a similar lens. And so we kind of were tasked with, how do we do that? What's the right way to do that? And, there's a lot of different ways to talk about trauma-informed care, but we had some experience with a model called the ARC framework. And that was what we chose to do to kind of push through all of our programs. And so I'm going to let Nick kind of tell you a little bit about the ARC framework now.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so this piece of our training could really be a multi-day training. Talking about ARC and the framework and how it can be implemented, there really is a lot to it. And we have done multi-day trainings for ARC in the past. But what I'm going to do is just give a brief kind of overview. But before I do, I was curious to know kind of our audience is how familiar our audience is with ARC. So if you don't care, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being, I know all about ARC, I've maybe done it for years, or I'm a trainer, and 1 being, hey, this is kind of brand new to me. If you don't care, kind of putting that in the chat, just so we have an idea of your understanding. Pretty broad spectrum so far. We got a lot of 1s, but also a lot of 4s I've seen, and a lot of in between. Okay, so that's great. That's great. And again, this part of our discussion, it's not going to make you an expert by any means, but at least it'll give you some ideas around the language and concepts with ARC. So our agency, we knew we needed something that we could both implement with the clients we served, but also as a framework for our staff. And so, it's been several years now, but we did our own little kind of ACE study within our agency. And what we found out is that our staff and our clients actually had pretty similar ACE scores. I think it was over 40% of our staff had a 4 or more when we looked at their ACEs. And so with that in mind, we knew we needed a framework that really could touch both kind of pieces of that and kind of look at that parallel process. So that was part of our decision making in choosing ARC. And when we're looking at ARC, it obviously stands for Attachment, Regulation, and Competency. But there's a couple other pieces you can see in there, and that's what we kind of call the foundation at the bottom, is engagement, education, routines, and rhythms. Under attachment is caregiver affect management, but we can also just think of affect management. Attunement, effective response. And then under regulation, identification and modulation. And competency there is executive functions, self-development and identity, and relational connection. And at the top, there's a trauma experience integration. And that's going to be more specific when you're thinking about how it works with clients, and a little less specific when we're talking about staff, because really by utilizing these blocks from a framework standpoint, we're allowing that trauma piece to kind of be met from a professional standpoint. So first, looking at the part that I call the foundation. The thing about these pieces, engagement, education, routines, and rhythms, is that's not something that we do one time and we're done. It really is woven throughout the ARC approach. It's continual, it's ongoing. And that's both with the clients we serve and as a framework with our agency. And that first part is engagement. And I really think of engagement being at the core of everything, both when we're thinking about working with clients and, working as a team or an agency. And so when I think of engagement, I really think of that rapport, the relationship, connection, all of those pieces, and how we have to have those things to kind of build up from there. And even with our agency, as far as engagement goes, that's what we set as an agency goal this year, is to kind of increase our employee engagement. And we measure that three times this year, maybe 4. And we're kind of looking at what engagement looks like from a staff standpoint. The next piece on there is education. And so again, education, when we think about with our clients, that's psychoeducation most of the time, or with families. We're informing them and helping them understand. But we also have to think about education and how we provide that as an agency. And so, offering a lot of trainings, offering professional growth opportunities, whether that be within your agency or outside of your agency or organization. And so education, again, has to be ongoing, and it has to be something that's ongoing for us too, as people that maybe are in the field, and that we're seeking our own opportunities to increase our understanding. Because again, new information, new research is always coming out. And the last piece on here is routine and rhythms. And so that, I think, is maybe more confusing for people when they hear that, especially the rhythms piece. And we also kind of tie in rituals into that. But with routine, we think about routine, especially in the foster care world, which is more of my world. Our kids come from very chaotic environments with hardly any predictability, whether it comes down to when they're going to get their next meal or how that caregiver is going to respond to them that day. And so when they come into foster care, something that we really push is that idea of having a routine, of creating predictability, because predictability for people who come from trauma really is safety, because they know what's going to happen next. They know what to expect. So it kind of lowers that sense of chaos. And so creating routine, both, again, with the families or clients that you serve, as well as an agency, that's going to promote safety. And one way we do that is through our ritual question, our ritual piece that we talk about. We talk about doing rituals within our homes. So there's a sense of creating, this is what we do as this family, and this creates belonging and connectedness by doing that. We talk about maybe doing an ice cream and movie night once a week. We talk about maybe just the ones that are already naturally built into these families. They go to church every Sunday and then they go and eat at the same restaurant. I know that was something I did. And it creates a sense of belonging. But for an agency, our rituals create that same sense of belonging. We open up and we give everyone kind of an opportunity to talk, to have a voice, and I'll talk more on that here briefly, so I'm not going to spend more time on that. And then the rhythm piece. Rhythms, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but the way we implement it the most with our clients anyways, is we create opportunities for rhythmic activity. And what I mean by that is we know there's a lot of brain science around if you create something that is repetitive and rhythmic in nature, that in itself can be very regulating and grounding for our kids and for their brains. And so we look at creating a lot of rhythmic type activities from a proactive standpoint. So that's kind of our foundation. The next part on here, as we're kind of stepping into attachment, I know there were 3 blocks that went with that. But before I talk more specifically, when we're thinking about attachment from a broader standpoint as an agency, we're really thinking about just feeling safe in relationships at work. And psychological safety is such a big piece of that. And so the quote here is, when you have psychological safety in the workplace, people feel comfortable being themselves. They bring their full selves to work and feel okay laying all of themselves on the line. And so that's why attachment is so important, and that psychological safety piece that's built into it. But now I'll speak more directly to kind of the blocks that we have in there. The first one, as it's listed in kind of the house picture, is caregiver affect management. But again, we're thinking at it from a broader standpoint as affect management. And this ties into regulation, obviously, which is our next set. But I think it's great that we build that piece into attachment and even talk about, as we use in our agency, the red ball. And so what I mean by that is the red ball is kind of an example of where, and for people to be able to talk about in maybe a less threatening way, where their energy or their emotions are at. And so we think about a red ball, and if you have a red ball and you're holding it kind of, center of your chest, that's a very comfortable place to be. That's a comfortable energy level, emotional level. You're fairly regulated when it's there. If your red ball is way up high, that means maybe your energy is very high. Maybe you're highly anxious, or you're just hyper, right? But if our red ball is very low, that's kind of representative of a lower energy level. So we think more of maybe depression, or maybe even burnout as we're thinking about our staff. So we use this red ball a lot to be able to talk about maybe how we're feeling, or where we're at that day in kind of a non-threatening way. And you can do the same thing with clients, families, kids, and it's kind of a good little check-in and way to kind of check in also for yourself where you're at. The next piece on there is attunement. So that's the capacity to accurately read cues and respond accordingly. So attunement, we think of, especially from a very, very early onset, attunement is that parent responding to that child. And that's really where it starts. We think about infants, and we think about, the kind of the serve and return piece. The baby makes a noise, or the baby makes a face, and the parent responds. So that's kind of the earliest piece of attunement. But attunement continues on from there. And when we're thinking about it from a work standpoint, what we're really doing is taking the time to understand where someone else is at in that moment. And so what we talk a lot about is just being curious. We all have beliefs. We all have kind of opinions about things. But by slowing down and allowing ourselves to be curious with someone, ask questions, try to see it from their perspective, try to understand how they're experiencing things, that really allows us to attune to them and ultimately have better outcomes. And again, we're creating psychological safety through that. So being curious is I think a tool, at least for me, that once I learned it pretty early on how to use that with clients. But once I learned to kind of utilize that as well with family and coworkers and everything else, it really changed a lot of things for me. So curiosity is a powerful tool. And the last one on here is effective response. So if we're thinking about it kind of step by step, check in with yourself, or the caregiver checks in with themselves. They kind of see where they're at. They maybe get the red ball lowered to a better place or raised to a better place. You then slow down and attune through curiosity. And then finally, you have to respond. And so responding effectively, it really varies from situation to situation, right? There's a piece of accountability that can be brought into responding effectively. It doesn't just mean always, just staying curious throughout. Especially if you're a supervisor, there's a piece of accountability that might come into that. But what we do know is effective responses avoid power struggles and they break conflict cycles. And so what I mean by that is, again, when we're thinking about it on the client level or a child and parent level, those power struggles are those back and forths, right? And so an effective response doesn't allow that back and forth. They what we call kind of drop the rope, right? The tug of war, you think about that, the back and forth of pulling. Well, it takes two people. So dropping the rope might be an effective response with a child, especially some of our kids that are in foster care. And then the conflict cycles, right? Conflict cycles a lot of times come from a place from both people coming in with maybe high energy or real low energy, and there's very emotional response that get brought into it, and then that triggers the other person. If we're thinking about the red ball, maybe one person's red ball is up here, and then the other person's red ball gets raised up here, and we're in that back and forth. And so again, by affect management and attuning, it allows us to kind of break out of that. It allows us to not respond in maybe such an emotional or heated way, and it allows us to slow down, be curious, and to break those conflict cycles. So that's one way to think about it when we're thinking about it as an organization. So our last piece here well, not our last piece, because we'll talk about competency, but our last piece that was on attachment to that effective response. Again, I still want to mention that that it's going to vary. It's going to vary from situation to situation. And so that's why it's such a broad piece. And so there's a lot more I could have gone in there. So regulation here is identifying and managing emotions. Very simple kind of term there, or thought process. But there's way more to it. So I finally want to make this a little more interactive and get some input from you all. And this is something we talk a lot about. So I want to know kind of what sort of things you all do proactively to maybe manage your emotions. So again, this is prior to, a heated situation or a conflict. So what sort of things do you all use to manage your emotions proactively? See a lot of breathing, going for a walk, journaling, music, staying hydrated and fed. Yeah, especially if we're thinking about the hierarchy of needs. That's a good one. Therapy, boundary setting, intentional breaks, sleep, mindfulness. Yeah, all these are great. Yeah, those are all things you can kind of plan ahead, right? That I'm going to be intentional about what I eat, how much, that I'm staying hydrated, that I'm setting breaks aside. So I'm staying in kind of that regulated place proactively. All good stuff there. Thank you all. So the next one I wanted to check in on is what do y'all do in the moment? So you're having that difficult situation, maybe that conflict that I was, mentioning a bit ago. And you notice yourself starting to get worked up. Maybe that red ball is starting to go up. What do y'all do just kind of in that moment when maybe you can't step away as much? Deep breathing, using some exercises from EMDR, just pause, pray. More pauses and breathing. Excellent. Yeah. I think at least with the clients I worked with for such a long time, you bring up deep breathing, they're like, oh no, Another therapist telling me to deep breathe, but it's hard not to, because deep breathing really does work. It sends a lot of information to the brain and body about calming down and relaxing. All right. Checking in with body. All right, good. Thank you all. And then how do you kind of decompress? So you've gone through that tough day. Maybe it was one where your red ball got really high, and now maybe at the end of the day, your red ball is really low. Your energy is really low, or maybe it's still really high. What sort of things do you do after to kind of get yourself back to that centered place? Cook, sing, reflect, anything active. Make time for fun, take a shower, white water, get creative, make something with my hands, yoga, dance it out, cook, clean, talk with someone. Peloton, nice. Spend time with family, painting, meditation. Yeah, I noticed a lot of those, were around some creativity or activity, physical activity. And I think that's something to keep in mind too, right? When we're thinking about that red ball, whether it's high or low, some people might be able to lower their red ball by doing something physical, but some people might be able to raise their red ball by doing something physical. So it really does vary, and it is important to think about these things. What can we do to stay regulated proactively? What can we do in the moment? And what can we do kind of after to get ourselves back and rejuvenated? So thank you all for taking the time on that. And then the last one on here is around co-regulation. And co-regulation is such an important piece, especially for the population that we serve and work with, because a lot of times the kids that we serve, they never really got that first block of attachment, and therefore they never really were able to build on top of that the ability to self-regulate. And so we almost have to kind of start at the beginning, and we talk a lot about co-regulation, and that's how the caregiver can kind of use themselves to help regulate. And again, we think about that at the very, very earliest onset. A baby cries out, they have a need. Well, in a healthy environment, the caregiver comes and they meet the need and they soothe them. And so the baby is then later has the ability to build on top of that, the ability to self-regulate. But again, when they don't get that early on, then we have to kind of build that in later. And so co-regulation is kind of involving our caregivers, the caregiving system, in a way to help regulate the child. But we can also do that with one another. So within, the workforce or your organization, how might you help others regulate? How might you co-regulate someone else? Lower my voice using calming tone. Talk less, listen more. Excellent. Ask thoughtful questions. Normalize it. Yeah, I still see some coming through, but yeah, we think about if we come to someone and our red ball is in a good place, and that's how we approach them, then it's a lot easier for them to lower their red ball or raise their red ball to where ours are. Help determine whether something is really urgent or just important. Being present. Yeah, eating lunch together. Listening. All right. Well, thank you all for that. Great answers. So our last piece here, and again, I'm going to be quick because I know we've still got quite a bit of material to go over, is competency. So competency, there's a piece of connection, identity, and executive functioning. So connection, we got to think about both connection to self and others when we think about connection. I know, and I just talked about it too, but we've heard so much about self-care, right? And especially during the pandemic. And what I think we realize is we still have to have that connection piece to really get to a better place. And so connection is really just that. It's taking the time and the intentionality to connect with one another. It might be through teaming activities, and then connection to self. Obviously, it might be like someone referenced therapy, right? So we're all kind of accountable there. The next piece on here, identity. So especially for if you all are someone that works with kids or adolescents, that identity piece is so important, because a lot of times they're trying to figure that out. They're at the point where they really don't know who they are. So creating opportunities where they can kind of, represent the way they want to through dress or through interests, right? And really encouraging that and pushing that. That's something we really push a lot as an agency too, is what sort of activities are we getting these kids in? Because a lot of times that can be more important than the therapy appointment, right? So given opportunities to start to develop some sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and identity. But for staff, having a clear role, understanding kind of what their job is and what they're supposed to be doing, helping create a healthy work-life balance, and then utilizing our employees' strengths. So what are we involving them in that maybe they're getting to use their skill set fully? And maybe it's even a little bit outside of their role. And then finally, executive functioning. And we're just kind of thinking about that as the appraisal of a situation and problem solving. So we know a lot of times, especially with people who have experienced complex trauma, that executive functioning piece is really, really delayed because they're always on kind of the lookout for danger, right? Rather than being able to really take the time and operate from the part of their brain that is responsible for making thoughtful decisions. So executive functioning is just always something we want to keep in mind, especially, with people who have trauma or complex trauma. So Chris, I'm going to kind of turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so there's, so to Nick's point, the what we can't separate from our rollout and our implementation of this ARC framework is that this really occurred during the depths of the pandemic. I think we really kind of got this going in, late 2020. And it's funny because as we were introduced to it prior to the pandemic, and we had some really good experiences in getting familiar with the framework. But as the pandemic wore on, it revealed itself to be more and more relevant to all of us, and again, that need for attachment and connection, that need to be able to regulate and co-regulate, and that need for competency, or our identities, and so on and so forth. Those were all really impacted by the pandemic. And so as we were doing this rollout, because the ARC was really designed for children and families who were coming from, what I would call a complex trauma background. But as we were discussing it, we really leaned on this framework to help us through the pandemic. And it's really, I think, influenced our viewpoint of it. And what I would suggest is, to some level, what traumatized families need is the same thing we all need. It's just maybe to a little bit more of a dosage because of their backgrounds. But really, there's a parallel process here that we can't, that just became very, very apparent the more we discussed and looked at this. So that takes us kind of into our implementation. So we wanted to do this trauma-informed approach. We had some familiarity with this ARC framework. That was really pretty simple on the front end, but could get more complex the more we dug into it. It looked at attachment, it looked at regulation, it looked at competency. We thought that made sense for our staff and our kids. So then we decided we wanted to implement it, and we just want to take the rest of our time to kind of share what that process looked like for us. So we had a 3-year plan. Year 1 was going to be a rollout, training and implementation. Year 2 was really going to be about embedding some of the language into our documentation. And then year 3 was going to be about fidelity and dealing with drift. So year one. So once we kind of decided that this is what we wanted to do, we reached out to the developers of the ARC framework, Margaret Blostein and Christine Kinneberg, and we developed a contract with them, and they assigned us a ARC consultant. Now our ARC consultant, I think there's a few people on this call that probably know John Ebert. You could not have asked for a more meaningful and just powerful ambassador of this model, and just all things that really are trauma informed. John is a fantastic individual. He's the head of the Center of Excellence at Vanderbilt. So we were very fortunate to get him as a consultant. And so we started partnering with him. And our first year rollout consisted of an all staff training. So we trained 525 staff. When we say all staff, we mean all roles and positions, including our back office, our accountants, our HR, everybody. We did that in four-hour virtual training spread across 2 weeks. So that was a pretty substantial endeavor. And again, John did that training for us, and he was a masterful trainer. The year one rollout consisted of, and a lot of this year one rollout is built on implementation science. So then we had we had an implementation team, which consisted of 10 to 12 individuals from across the organization, a variety of roles. They had a once a month implementation call where they were kind of tackling some issues and what we wanted to do to push this down. We had 12 monthly clinical consultations, and this was really focused on our clinicians. And this was kind of an interesting experience. It was pretty impactful. We would have on average about 150 clinicians reviewing a single case. Now, if that sounds like a logistical nightmare, it could have been, but there was a really great structure. A small team would identify a case, would present the case to the group. There was a template for doing that. And then we could really dig in from a clinical perspective on how to apply the ARC framework from a really clinical role. So we had the clinicians kind of learning it over the course of a year. We had our implementation team who, as they tried to implement, were continuing to learn the framework as they implemented. And then we had 4 leadership consultations, which were once a quarter. And our executive leadership team would be on there just to kind of talk about how things were going, what they were experiencing, seeing, feeling, all those sorts of things. So that was our year one rollout. So like I said, the clinical consultations were really impactful because we got to really do that deep dive with a lot of our clinicians. And while we were doing that with them, our implementation team really had to kind of come up with some concrete ideas of what to deliver, right? So we looked at it from 4 different kind of different areas. We wanted to look at our marketing to our agency, really more messaging than marketing. How do we get this messaging and continue it once we had that initial training, because we didn't want to lose it once we had it? How do we have ongoing training? How did it impact our policy, and how did it impact our procedures? So these are some of the things we looked at. So the messaging part of the implementation team really wanted to create some materials that could push the philosophy down, that could continue the learning. We looked at things called posters, things like posters, infographics, and explainer videos, and I'll touch on those here in a minute. We looked at developing training for specific roles. We looked at policies. Now, that policies and procedures was a tough one, because how do you look at all your policy and procedures through a trauma-informed perspective, right? That was a big ask, but we think we had a way to figure that out. So the marketing subgroup, they worked on a couple different things, and I want to share one with you just in a second. So the first thing we looked at was what we called infographics. I think people are familiar with infographics, but we wanted the messaging to be succinct, concise, and consistent. So once a month, we would release a new infographic that covered one of the boxes that Nick mentioned earlier. So 1 month it may be affect regulation. 1 month it was attunement. 1 month it was executive functioning. And we just kind of kept releasing these in a consistent manner with a brief, just as part of our general, communications, we gave it a quick picture, a quick definition, and we just kind of wanted to keep that message coming. We created what we call the cheat sheet. And this was interesting because we had a conversation with somebody who said, attachment to me, this is one of our back office folks, an attachment to me is something that comes along with an email. A regulation to me is something that is a rule I got to follow by the government. And that we kind of realized we had some work to do when those comments were coming through. So someone said, we just need a cheat sheet that we can a quick reference guide, so I can look back at it and just get a quick memory of what that was. So we created something like that. We recruited volunteers from across our company to help with those different things, to help with those infographics and the cheat sheet. And then we made these things called explainer videos, because again, we were trying to think about, you do a training one time, how do you keep it going? And so once a month, we would release these things called explainer videos, and we would take a concept from the ARC framework, and we made these little videos out of them. And I'm going to try to share one with you right now, just to give you a sample of what it looks like. It's about 2 minutes long. And hopefully it doesn't freeze up on me. So.
Jeff, I was really impressed with Mr. Smith, weren't you? He showed great attunement with Mike.
What is attunement?
Attunement is when you accurately read another person's cues and respond accordingly.
Within the ARC model, attunement is part of the attachment component.
And within the ARC model, attachment is focused on creating safety in relationships.
Jasmine, how did Mr. Smith show attunement earlier?
Mr. Smith noticed that the 9-year-old boy he is fostering continues to have behavioral issues around dinner. He was able to connect that behavior to the neglect the child experienced when they were younger.
His active listening helped the child calm down, and now the behavior is happening less frequently.
Attunement is important with our work at Omni Community Health too. Earlier today, I saw an action with one of our OCH care coordinators providing CTT services. The care coordinator noticed hesitancy in a client whenever her husband entered the room. When the husband wasn't present, the care coordinator asked the client about the behavior change to learn more.
That makes a lot of sense. For 3LS and Omni Family of Services, one way we show attunement is seeking out employee feedback, whether through our Amplify survey, virtual town halls, Omni Family Today suggestion box, or other small surveys. Our leadership then uses that feedback to guide decisions that impact staff.
Yes, that's attunement.
Exactly. Now you got it.
At the Omni family, whether you're in a program role like foster care, family preservation, or behavioral health, or an administrative role like IT or HR, it's important that we create safety in relationships by staying attuned to one another.
So I don't know. I hope that audio shared dawned on me that it might not have, but yeah. So we did those little videos. We tried to use concrete examples to take these concepts and apply them to people's day to day. We tried to do it with whether it's the foster care or outpatient or our in-office folks, and we release those on a regular basis to try to keep these concepts at the front of mind. The second thing we really worked on with training, we looked at a introduction for all new staff because we realized we had to be training new folks as they came on. So we created an ARC 101 training for all new staff to come into the Omni family. We created some advanced trainings for clinicians that we offer on a biannual basis, twice a year, that do a deeper dive into the clinical applications of the ARC model. And then we did monthly ARC foster parent trainings that we've currently are offering quarterly. But in the first couple of years of our ARC foster parent trainings, and Nick led these and did a great job, we had somewhere in the range of 1,000 to 1,500 participants in those trainings. And so we continue to try to push those concepts onto our foster parents the best we could to those sorts of trainings. From there, so we did the messaging, we looked at the ongoing training needs, and then we moved to policy and procedure. And I'm going to let Nick kind of touch on those two things.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I got put in the policy and procedure group. I think I must have missed the meeting where they were assigning groups, because policy and procedures probably not one of my strengths, but it was a great learning opportunity, and I really think some positive things came out of that. And one thing we did, and Chris already mentioned this, but basically we took 5 policies and procedures within the organization, and we broke those down, but we had to create an audit tool to make sure that we are kind of using ARC, even in the language of our policy and procedures. And so this audit tool, there were 22 questions. We broke it into 6 sections of our values at the Omni family: empowerment, safety, embracing diversity, emotional intelligence, and mindful collaboration, which of course we can easily put all those sections into one of the ARC blocks. And then basically we looked at the policy and procedure and went through each of those questions, and kind of had the boxes, whether yes, that was being met, no, it wasn't, maybe it wasn't applicable. And depending on, what kind of the outcome, we also had next steps and notes around that. And so that was a tool, again, that kind of gets to live on and can be used in the future for looking at policy and procedure. And again, we did 5 initially, but that was one of kind of our deliverables that came out of it. Another deliverable that came out was, Chris, if you don't care, going that next slide, was the ARC meeting facilitation best practice guide. Doesn't have the greatest name to it, it's a mouthful, but it was a useful tool nonetheless. And so this was something I went a little rogue with and kind of was working on as part of the policy and procedure group. But what this guy basically did, I think, was helpful in helping people facilitate a meeting in an ARC way. And so it's pretty lengthy, the guide, the practice guide, but I broke it down to kind of a simple 6-step piece here. The first one being aware of your own affects, right? That affect management, that regulation. Everyone should kind of check in on themselves before stepping into this meeting, especially if you're facilitating a meeting, and kind of be aware of where your red ball is at. The second step on there is making sure we're informing of an agenda prior to the meeting. So we're creating predictability, right? Early on in the process. So kind of sending that out. The third step is decide if a pre-meeting is necessary. I know as an agency and an organization, even within ourselves, is we don't always necessarily agree. That happens. We know that happens. But, especially if we're having a meeting externally, maybe it's with, the department or whoever, we want to make sure that at least we're all understanding where each other are coming from. So maybe a pre-meeting is a necessary step internally before having maybe an external meeting. And so decide if a pre-meeting is necessary. Then once the meeting actually starts, we want to make sure we're creating some psychological safety, and that's where our ritual question comes in. We always like to start with a check-in question, and I'll give some examples of those here shortly on the next slide. The next one is review agenda or set an intention or goal for the meeting. So again, we've all checked in with each other. We've all kind of had a voice. We've connected a little bit to start the meeting, and then we're looking at kind of what are we doing here today? What do we want to accomplish? Because I'm sure you all have been on your fair share of meetings. You come out of there and you're like, well, we got nothing done. Or you say that could have been done over an email. So kind of setting some intention and a goal is always useful. And then finally, as we're going through that meeting and we do this, with Omni, with our consultation process, is we want to make sure we're capturing action steps, who is responsible for each of those action steps, and a target completion date. And again, that's another part of predictability and accountability, which can be tied in. And so that's kind of the way that we kind of wrap things up and even summarize that at the end of the meeting and make sure everyone's on the same page. And then, a last step that I didn't even really list on here, but would be sending that out to the group. So everyone kind of knows who and when and what and where these things are supposed to be done. And then again, here's some of the sample ritual questions. This is also included on the practice guide that we have. But we want to be mindful with these ritual questions, because the whole idea behind these ritual questions are we want to make everyone feel included. We want to make everyone feel like they have a voice and that everyone is connecting a little bit. So these ritual questions should be intentional. I mean, I hate to say it, but I've been in meetings where I've seen people ask a ritual question that kind of excluded people. And an example of that would be asking about a specific holiday, like, what are you going to do for Christmas? Well, not everyone celebrates Christmas. And so being mindful of that piece, that we're not kind of creating exclusion, but rather inclusion, is really important. So just a few, examples here. What's an act of kindness you've recently experienced? What is a favorite seasonal memory? What is a recent win or success you've had? What's something you're grateful for? So again, something that everyone can answer, everyone can kind of be included in, and everyone kind of has a voice.
Hey, Nick, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
Two things. Just to build off that, we use ritual questions, but we also saw some other really neat rituals. We saw, some meetings that would start. Every meeting started with a song that got played first, and that song was a way to, everyone was kind of always like, what song are we going to start with? And that became a thing. We saw rituals with Hawaiian Shirt Friday, and everybody on the meeting had to wear a Hawaiian shirt. Rituals can take a lot of different forms and shapes. But again, this was a very powerful ritual for our group, because when COVID was going, we transitioned from a lot of in-person meetings to a lot of virtual meetings, and how do we stay connected? This was a very powerful thing with that. We did have a quick question, Nick, and I'll take a shot at answering it first, because I've seen it for a second, but then you can, I'll give it back to you. There was the question of, could you please comment on how you implemented ARC framework with your foster parents? I imagine that it would be different with that than within your organization. And so just to address that question, we try to offer regular training on it. That was one key component for us. We wanted to get that messaging out. We wanted people speaking the language to the best we could. And so, like I said, Nick did a monthly for the first couple of years. We've kind of shifted to quarterly now. So that's definitely one big step that we took. The one other thing I would offer to add to that is we have embedded a consultation process that we've had some really good success with. I think last year we did about 250 consultations, and on those consultations we have 2 master's level clinicians. Nick leads this initiative, and we really try to lead by example in a lot of ways. We try to use that as an opportunity to name some of those things that Nick has already mentioned. We talk about attunement, we talk about regulation. And so we really try to use that as an opportunity to reinforce the things that are presented in the trainings. And I think we've had some really good success with that. Nick, do you want to add anything to that?
Not much. Yeah, I think the trainings was a big piece of it, because again, we were able to offer it, pretty frequently. And with us being able to offer it virtually, we were able to include foster parents, in Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee. And then once we kind of gave that introductory language around it and some of the specifics, we were able to kind of lean more into certain topics that we know our foster parents see a lot with our kids, and then use that same language and thought process of ARC kind of towards different topics, whether it be problematic sexual behaviors, or whether it be just some of those hot button issues that we know that the behaviors that really kind of tick off our foster parents. So I think that was big. And like Chris said, then being able to follow up with the consultation process and utilize, because when we're doing those consultations, we're using that kind of best practice guide in a lot of ways. So year 2 was documentation. So Chris talked about year 1. I kind of finished it with the policy and procedure piece. But year 2 documentation, what we looked at here was including ARC language into at least one commonly used document within every single program of Omni, of the Omni family, I should say. So we looked for representation for someone that was either part of that program or related to, and we created work groups, and then everyone or a couple people were responsible for teaming up, picking a document within that's commonly used, and seeing how they could kind of implement some ARC language. Just an example with the program that I oversee, we chose treatment plans, and all we did was very simple, but I think effective, is we broke our treatment planning into 3 sections: attachment, regulation, and competency. And, not each section had to have a goal in there, but it could obviously be offered. And then our clinicians just were asked to kind of decide where that goal falls into. So even our clinicians were thinking about, this is kind of involves attachment, or this involves regulation. And so that was just an example of how we kind of embedded it there. And then obviously we had to have some pretty strong support from our team that uses our EHRs and stuff like that. So they were an incredible support to get that language and the forms built back into our system.
So that was a big part of year 2, and that took a lot of work. You don't want to blow past that, but we really wanted to have that language embedded in as much of our documentation as we could. And that was really a big ask, and a lot of work went into that. We even had it on our supervision forms, which when you start looking at supervision through an ARC format, looks a lot in many ways like reflective supervision, and so we were really happy to get that embedded into our documentation. And now we're in year 3, and this is where we're at right now. We're trying to prevent drift. We've had some successes, but we also are mindful that this is when things have a tendency to wane. So we really have concentrated on 2 concrete deliverables for this year. We wanted to update and revamp our ARC 101 onboarding training, and so we've done that. What we are doing is bringing new facilitators for that training. So we have some new champions that will then go back to their different programs. It's really what we hope we're kind of hitting 2 boxes at once. So we're getting that training to our new folks the way that we need to, but we're also developing a new layer of leadership around that. Some new kind of experts on it, some new champions for it, that can then go back and be spokespeople in their respective programs. The other deliverable we are excited about is we are having we're really targeting our mid-level managers, our team leaders, and they're going to be having a summit, and we are going to be talking about leadership through an ARC lens there. And how do you apply the ARC perspective to leadership? And again, there's lots of great stuff out there when you think about a trauma-informed approach. There's great people out there talking about this sort of stuff now, right? The Simon Sinek's and the Brene Browns are really great with that sort of thing. So I know we're getting kind of close to the end of our time. I wanted to share just a few lessons learned that we've had. Clear is kind, and there's my Brene Brown. I'm stealing that from her. But how you do that with something like this is really interesting. So one of the things that we would advocate for, or that was a success for us, and this is, I've tried to do this in previous locations, and this is where we went off the rails probably. But we really took a project management approach to this rollout. And that's not something that I think we talk about a lot in our social services, but we had a project manager, and you don't have to have a project manager, but I do think someone to own the implementation, to guide it. Our project manager worked closely with our consultant. And so what that looks like is, putting some dates down. When are we going to have this date done? Kind of controlling the communication, holding us accountable, right? Because we all have our day-to-day jobs that we had to get done, and someone to follow up with us in a helpful and useful way to say, hey, let's get this agenda for the meeting down, or what have you. So someone who can kind of guide it and own it and kind of manage the project, because it is a project. Along those lines, we had a charter. So we really took the time at the beginning, and really an ARC kind of concept is to go slow to go fast. And I think creating a charter or a clear plan of some sort is a great example of that. It's going slow, mapping out what you want to do, mapping out when you want to get it done by, so you can start to put things into play. Attainable deliverables. I think that this is really, really important. I would suggest to get granular. What can you deliver? What can you truly, and that's a big question, because we want to deliver everything to our clients. The people who are, anybody who's listening to a talk on this is passionate for their clients. We want to give them everything, but what can we actually truthfully and pragmatically deliver that's important. It's extremely important to get down to that level. A manageable team size. One of the things that I think we realized is at times we had 10 to 12 on a team, and that's a big group to navigate. If you're trying to implement something, 4 to 6 seems to be a good size. Focusing on processes and not outcomes. We want the outcome to be good, but I think if we, one of the things that we realized, if we really focus on putting the language in our documentation, or if we focused on doing the consultations or the trainings, those were things we could control, right? And so whatever the outcomes will be, they will be, but we focused on things we could control. And then the last thing is, and this is a project management term that we've learned that I think has been very helpful. Be mindful of what project managers might call scope creep. And that's really just the scope of your implementation, kind of getting to the point where you can't manage it. There's lots of good ideas out there, but again, we can't necessarily always do all of them. And so sometimes that can end up derailing what you can do. And so being mindful of again, being practical in what we can implement, how we can do it, and not letting the scope of the project get beyond what's manageable. Our successes, we kind of mentioned a couple of these, so I won't, belabor these, but we do have our ongoing ARC quarterly foster parent trainings that we're again, always trying to be training. We have our ARC 101, we have our ARC for clinicians. So we're keeping the education going. It's still funny to see some of our folks who are not clinically oriented asking ritual questions. It's just kind of heartwarming. And then we have implemented all of the children who come into our level 3 trauma treatment foster care program are screened for trauma. Every single one. It's just part of what we do, and we do it regularly. So those are some of our wins. Some of our ongoing challenges. With turnover comes the need to kind of do it all over again a lot of times. We've had some competing regulations that have really, what we call the whirlwind in a lot of ways. Our day-to-day operations just can sometimes pull you away from it. We've had, we're working currently on trying to push, get more trauma screening into a couple of our other programs that haven't taken to it quite as naturally. And that's something that happens. There's pockets that are slow to adopt it, and we are continuously working on that. Because we had some wins, but I'll tell you, we've had a lot of hard learnings as well, and we have a long way to go. We have some foster parents that I think are pretty ARC informed now, and we have some that have not wanted to adopt it, or want to adopt it, but struggle because of the stress of the work and things like that. So we have a long way to go, and we have a lot to learn ourselves, but that's where that idea of it's a practice, that's where we come at it from. And I think the last thing we'd say is this is really about a cultural change. And if this is corresponded with our DEI rollout, this is corresponded with a focus on emotionally intelligent leadership. And I think as you do that, you really get a culture change. And I know we're up against time, but I do want to make sure, and I see a couple of questions we'll try to answer real quick. I did want to give you a couple of resources. If this is something that is of interest to you, or if you're working on this, there is pretty much a manual on the ARC model called Treating Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents by Margaret Blostein and Christine Kinneberg. It's a wonderful book that has all kinds of useful activities and things along those lines for clients, and really that you can apply to in a lot of different ways. I saw that the arc.org was put into the chat, so I would definitely check that out if I were you. Also, if you're just really more interested in trauma-informed care on a more general level, there is an organization called University of Buffalo Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care Organization. It's a mouthful, but they actually have a step-by-step manual that is a really valuable resource. If you just kind of want to look at that, you can request it on their website, and they will send it to you. And it's a great tool for rolling out trauma-informed care. I know most of the folks on here were trauma-informed, so just if you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score or What Happened to You, I would argue that those are essential reading for anybody who wants to operate from a trauma-informed perspective. So just a couple of resources there. Saw a couple of questions come in, so I just want to try to hit these real quick. First one says, ARC and trauma-informed training is critical at all levels of the organization, from front desk to leaders. Is there a plan to ensure there's training for people at all levels rather than leaders alone? That is why our ARC 101 is geared for everyone. We have tried to use examples in that training of how it applies to everybody from a clinician to a front desk staff. Saw a great example one time of a front desk person at a front desk de-escalating a upset client because the scheduling had been wrong, and she attuned to him and helped him co-regulate. And we use that as an example to show how that's relevant. So we try to hit everybody coming in the door with that. So that is an ongoing thing. So that every single person that comes through continues to get that. And that's how we try to get some of those front desk folks. Second question is, prior to training your staff, did you complete any type of screening on the current climate of your organization, like the trauma-informed climate scale? Not before doing ARC, but this was, we had done we had a kind of start and stop that was a little earlier, a couple of years prior to us unrolling this. And we had at that time done one. And I don't think it was the trauma-informed climate scale, but we had done a more organized kind of climate survey. We knew, because we knew that, and Nick had referenced, because we knew the ACE scores of our staff, we felt like that told us what we needed to know. We were able to get 500 and some plus ACE scores of staff members, and 40% had 4 or more, I think, compared to like 15% of the original ACE study. So we knew our folks needed this type of approach. So we kind of went based on that. What have you found to be the best screener for trauma in pediatric populations? Looking to implement trauma screener in our pediatrics department as a way of screening and seeing patients in our integrated care model. That's great. I will say this, there's a lot of different trauma screens out there. So I think finding one that you feel comfortable with is important. We've actually had some debate on the ones that we've used. One of the more popular ones that clinicians use is the UCLA trauma screen. There's actually the child and adolescent. We actually moved to the child and adolescent trauma screen because it's a little bit more user friendly. So that's the one we like. That might be a little too much for you, but again, there's multiple out there. Nick, do you have anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, what we like too with the child and adolescent trauma screen is there's a caregiver and, a client part of that. So we're able to kind of look at both at times, or if the child's younger, and unable to answer. So, but yeah, I mean, like Chris said too, the UCLA was something we used prior for years as well.
And I think I think I saw it come up in the chat, but there's the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is another great organization and great set of resources. They have things on trauma-informed classrooms, things on trauma related to natural disasters. I know when the tornadoes came through Kentucky a couple years ago, that's where I went to try to find materials to equip our folks to process that. And so I highly encourage folks to collect where those resources are, because there are really good resources out there. But yeah, there's definitely a handful of different screeners that I think can be used. Even an ACE score, there's a great, the ACE score is a good starting point. Sometimes that can tell you a great deal of information. I know we're starting to tick over, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and Michelle, I'll turn it back over to you there. But Nick and I are both available for more questions if any should come up. But thank you all for your time, and we appreciate you.
Thank you all. That was exactly the presentation I was hoping you would give. It was great, and maybe even more. So thanks, Nick and Chris, and thanks everyone for coming. Please give us some feedback. And watch your emails for our next resilience talk in September.